Welcome back to the second of three Loeb lectures in physics. It's a pleasure to have Professor Sara Seager give us the second of the three lectures. Yesterday was exoplanets and the search for atmospheric biosignature gases. Today, Professor Seager is going to talk about Venus as a potentially habitable planet before she turns tomorrow to the search for another Earth. Thank you very much.
Hello, can you all hear me? Great. So I wanted to put a question mark at the end of my title. But usually when there's a question mark on a title, the answer turns out to be no or wrong. So I left it like this. So just over a year ago, I was part of a team that made an announcement that shook the world of planetary science. This is a story of innovation, exploration, and I invite you to think about your own work and to try new things. So let me take you on this journey of exploration. My first few slides are similar to yesterday, just in case people weren't here, but I'll go through them quickly. And it's a story that starts billions of years ago, when a simple single-celled bacteria, cyanobacteria, figured out something very clever, how to extract energy from its environment. So as a waste byproduct, they produce oxygen, which eventually accumulated to fill our atmosphere to 20% by volume. So we humans, we need oxygen to breathe, but without life, without plants and photosynthetic bacteria, we would have basically no oxygen in our atmosphere. So I always like to think of an intelligent alien civilization, if it exists on a planet orbiting a nearby star, with the kind of telescopes we're hoping to build, and they look here, and they see oxygen, and they can figure out that it's not made in large quantities by volcanoes or lightning or meteorites. They'll be suspicious that there might be life on this planet. So we're looking for a gas that's like way out of equilibrium, chemical equilibrium in context with its environment. That's biosignature. I'm going to get to the story, but the team that I was working with, we made a detection of a gas on Venus that can't be made in great quantities by volcanoes or lightning or meteorites, called phosphine. And I'm going to tell you a bit about the story of phosphine. And then I have two other things to tell you. If there could be life on Venus, if it's a habitable world, how does that work? And then in the third part of my talk, I have a special name for it, signs of life or a conjunction fallacy. So for this introduction, this was from yesterday as well, last lecture, that my guiding principle in the search for signs of life is just that we might not even know what we're looking for. Life on Earth produces oxygen. It's supposedly a fantastic biosignature gas. It's created in large quantities. It's very out of chemical equilibrium in context with its environment. But we have a problem because oxygen has not been around for Earth's entire life, actually. So we really want to be able to think about what kind of gases might be produced elsewhere. And you have to go back to watch the recording of lecture 1 to get more of the story. But the bottom line is that there are thousands of molecules produced by life and thousands more that are in gas form at room temperature and pressure. And we can tabulate all of these molecules. We can have computer algorithms. So here you see a sea of molecules filling chemical space. A subset of these molecules are sorted by our algorithms into 3 streams. To understand the talk, you actually don't have to understand that intro. I was just trying to say, by my team's overly complicated computer machinery, one of the brilliant people on my team, Janusz Petkowski, he recognized that there are literally some molecules, some fragments of molecules we call motifs that appear to never be produced by life, and we're working through that. So long story short, we came across this very interesting gas as a biosignature, and that gas is called phosphine. It popped out for us both as an interesting gas and one that seems to be rarely made or used by life. So phosphorus, P, it's an essential element for all life on Earth. It's used by life as phosphate. Indeed, here on Earth, there's very little hydrogen, and phosphine is highly thermodynamically disfavored. Initially, it appears to be almost completely absent from biology. But it turns out, and people might complain that we don't actually know exactly which life form makes phosphine, and it's also very toxic and unstable. But it turns out that although we don't know the exact biochemical pathway, people find phosphine in wetlands and oxygen-free environments. And people also find phosphine in animal guts. It's only, on Earth anyway, phosphine is only associated with life. It's probably on some kind of strain of E. coli. People find it in mixed cultures of bacteria in their lab. So it's clear that phosphine is made by life. Also, it is toxic and unstable. It would be very dangerous for us, but that's only true in oxidized environments. So as part of my introduction, I wanted to just briefly go over phosphine and where we are. But the story goes back about 5 years ago to Professor Jane Greaves, who decided to actually try to search for signs of life on Venus. Now, this is really fringe. It's way out there. And she's a radio astronomer, so she wanted to use James Clerk Maxwell Telescope. It's in Hawaii. She proposed to use it and initially failed, but eventually got some time. And because my group was independently working on phosphine as a biosignature gas for exoplanets, someone connected our two teams. Why is it so crazy? Because Venus, actually, it's really a terrible place for life. You will all know that due to a massive carbon dioxide greenhouse atmosphere, Venus, the surface temperature is over 700 degrees Kelvin. It's too hot for life of any kind. Complex molecules, proteins, etc., cannot survive on the surface. But for over half a century, since Carl Sagan first proposed this very speculative concept, perhaps there is life on Venus. But just like Earth and most planets, it gets colder. So if you ever hike up a mountain, it gets colder as you go above the surface. Well, way up 50 kilometers above the surface of Venus, the temperature is actually not too hot, not too cold, just right for life. And if we think about the basic things we think life needs, energy, liquid, the right temperature, maybe changing conditions, it's all there in the clouds. However, it is still an incredibly nasty environment. It's extremely dry, like there's very little humidity. And the droplets, they aren't made of water, which is needed for all life as we know it, but they're made of concentrated sulfuric acid. Now, you should know that on Earth, we have bacteria in our clouds, actually. Life gets swept up from the surface, and it stays in the clouds for some time, maybe a week. A good part, most of that life is actually inside the cloud droplets. So it's an idea, and yeah, it's kind of there. So we worked with Professor Jane Greaves. The initial signal was somewhat weak. Helped her write a proposal for the ALMA, Atacama Large Millimeter Array, ALMA, which is in Chile. It's high and dry. It's good for astronomy there. And the team found a signal of phosphine. It's been incredibly controversial. It's like a full-time job for Professor Greaves to respond to every criticism. We did work out in a lot of detail, and this is my intro, so I'm just kind of recapping for you with references if you want to read more. But remember, the premise of a biosignature gas is a gas that doesn't belong, that shouldn't be there. In this case, Venus, like Earth, little hydrogen. Phosphine is not favorable, very, very highly unfavored thermodynamically, so it's hard to make phosphine. And you can kind of work through any scenario you want to choose, and it turns out to be difficult, usually by orders of magnitude, to produce even the tiny amounts of phosphine we think we see on Venus. So I just put some numbers there. For example, for volcanoes, Venus does have active volcanoes. But if you wanted to generate phosphine, you would need more active volcanoes than exist. And you'd also need a very water-rich mantle, so you have a source of hydrogen. Yes, there's a question in the back.
So how do we know that the gases with hydrogen are not efficient?
Yeah, that's
You
a good
meant
question.
to repeat the question.
Right. Okay. How do we know that the gases are not efficiently produced? We do measure gases coming off of the volcanoes, like not directly, but what's in the atmosphere. So yeah, I don't have a great specific answer for that, but in general, we have some evidence that under the surface of Venus, there's not a lot of hydrogen, so hydrogen-rich gases can't be made easily.
In other words, do we know they would make it to the observable region?
That's a different story because that involves like diffusion and photochemistry and things like that, yeah. Well, we have an inventory of what gases are there, and so we can probably, let me think about that during the talk, and if I have a better answer, I can give it to you later. So why is this so controversial? Aside from Venus being a terrible place for life, it falls into 4 categories. One really criticism I actually really like is that when we're trying to find a gas elsewhere, we'd like to see several features, not just one. There happens to be only one feature available here at millimeter wavelengths, which is the 1-0 rotational transition. Okay, so that's like if you saw a partial fingerprint smudged, not so helpful. You'd like to see like the full set of fingerprints. There's other ones having to do with chemistry, but as we heard the question, it's somewhat unconstrained. There's one where people, because we only have one line, perhaps it's made by something else. And there's another contender, sulfur dioxide, which is a pretty, it's like a well-known trace gas on Venus. But it's unlikely to be that one because we dug around and found another observation just a few days earlier of sulfur dioxide. There's not enough of it for it to be that signal. And then the biggest kind of contender is data analysis. It's actually a very hard measurement to make. We can see Venus tonight if it's clear. Venus is very bright and it's spatially resolved, and it's not really a great thing for our large observatories, actually, which are made to look at fainter things. And so it's a very tricky data analysis. People have independently reanalyzed the data. Some people have not recovered the signal. Other people have recovered the signal, but again, want to associate it with something else. So yeah, newly published papers contradict each other. And independently from these observations, there's old data from NASA's Pioneer Venus mission, which went to Venus in the early 1980s, actually. And it went down through the atmosphere and used a mass spectrometer to ionize gases that got sucked into the machine. And by accelerating them and subjecting them to magnetic field, can tell the mass and charge of the parent ions, and was able to have some independent evidence for phosphine. So I just wanted to sort of set the stage here. I wanted to reflect for a moment back to lecture 1, where I was saying we have some planets, we have a new telescope coming online, the James Webb. We want to find gases that don't belong, that we can, attribute to life. It's a very tricky business because in that case as well, tricky data analysis, small signal, even more unknowns about the underlying chemistry of the planet. So we also have another example of a biosignature gas, methane on Mars, which has been an ongoing debate for 15 years. 15 years ago, people detected methane on Mars with ground-based telescopes. There have been 2 orbiters, one saw it, one didn't. There's a lander, a rover, that has measured tiny amounts of sporadic methane bursts. Now, methane could be made by life or it could be geologic processes, but this whole biosignature thing, it's it's going to be a tough sell. So phosphine, I like to think of it as, just for lack of a better word, like a gateway drug. So many people got fixated on this, and it somehow reinvigorated the interest in Venus. I mean, there have been people working on Venus. There are lots of people working on Venus, wanting to send missions back to Venus for many decades. And there's now a suite of missions going back. Okay, so that was sort of the introduction. There's no conclusion to that. It's just going to go on. It's going to be debated for a while. So I'm going to jump now to my second topic, which is how would life persist aloft? Like, if there is life on Venus, how does that stay up there? And the thing is that we would argue that if there is life, some kind of microbial type life, it needs to be inside droplets where it's sort of sheltered from the harsh, very dry environment outside. But these droplets, these concentrated sulfuric acid cloud particles, they connect, like they collide and they coagulate and they grow over time. So if there's life in droplets, just imagine this for a moment, that it's reproducing and you have this droplet and the droplet grows with time. Eventually the droplet will settle out due to gravity. So in this picture, like all life will somehow settle out to where it's so hot. If it keeps settling down to the hotter layers, we can't have life persisting aloft. So how would this happen? Here I'm showing you a calculation that has to match the actual measured cloud size distribution, showing you altitude above the surface, particle radius in microns, and time scale. So that typical settling time is shown by this contour plot and by these lines here. So like a 1 or micron particle would survive for, let's say a month or so. Certainly long enough for life, at least here, to reproduce and survive. Well, you might want to think of fragmentation, because if particles could fragment, that would be great, because then each new individual life form after reproduction could make its own, live in its own droplet. But fragmentation doesn't happen in this atmosphere. Just it's it's not the right conditions. Like if you want to think of disturbing hydrodynamic forces compared to stabilizing surface tension, you can use this Weber number to quantify it. But the point is, if you want to think about raindrops, there's this sort of classic picture. Raindrops are really big drops. They're like millimeters, and their terminal velocities are like meters per second. But on Venus, from this figure, the particles are small. They're like not millimeters, they're like microns. And they're traveling very, very slowly, so they can't fragment. So I actually worked out, oh, by the way, what I wanted to tell you, I wanted to build on something I mentioned before and tell you about Venus. This contour plot at the bottom, it's showing you altitude in kilometers and particle radius and the number density of particles. The cloud base is shown by this dashed line. And what you're supposed to see is that in the clouds, there are particles ranging from smaller than a micron. Some particles are as big as about 8 microns, but it's just to give you a handle on the size distribution. It's actually measured by the Pioneer Venus probe. And I wanted to remind all of you that particles have, different types of particles have unique scattering properties. And I was reminding you of that by the double rainbow, which hopefully you've all seen. And rainbows come from refraction and internal reflection of water droplets. But have any of you seen the glory? That picture, can you see it? It's hard to see with the picture. There's an airplane and there's like this color. Some of you have seen that. If you're on the plane, you should look for this actually. The other day I was on a plane and I looked out and I saw some weird color ripples, and then I did see the glory actually. And so there are these scattering effects, and I showed you on the bottom here, I'm showing you this. It's kind of hard to tell what this is, but it's showing you this sort of 360 degrees. You have to imagine light coming from this side. And in this particular fictitious particle of a certain size and composition, it has this very weird scattering shape. And oddly enough, this is even made on a logarithmic scale in R. So some particles have, they want to scatter in the forward direction primarily. And it turns out that for spherical particles, this scattering phase function depends only on the particle size compared to the wavelength of light and on the index of refraction. So this instrument, on one of the instruments on Pioneer Venus, it went down in a probe and it shined a light out of a sapphire window, and it measured what came back in polarization and intensity over some function of angle, and then could pick out what was there. And that's how they extracted this particle size distribution. So it's just trying to show you that there's actually some real data, and this real data, the sedimentation and coagulation rates and everything else comes out of a very detailed computer model that's anchored by the real data. So I want to tell you about my proposed life cycle just very briefly. And the weird thing is, in this field of, is Venus habitable? For a long time, they're just review articles putting pieces together. And so even though this may sound like really out there science, people really appreciated putting something quantitative to this problem. I was surprised at that positive reaction. So this simply is a cartoon of Venus's atmosphere going from 0 to 100 kilometers and showing you a temperature and pressure scale here. The cloud layer is demarked by these dashed lines. So the thought is that there's some kind of life cycle where the life is reproducing in the droplets. The droplets do eventually settle out, but the liquid evaporates, leaving behind spores, which populate a lower haze layer that actually exists, and it has unknown composition. Eventually, these particles get lofted back up, and they can act as cloud condensation nuclei to set this kind of cycle going again. So for what it's worth, this Venus atmosphere, by the way, right below the clouds, it's very stable. There's no convection there. But there are gravity waves from winds moving over mountains and from convective overshoot from below that trigger gravity waves that just go in the vertical direction and eventually dissipate, and they can presumably mix material. So that's sort of just a concept of how life might persist aloft indefinitely, because the surface is far too hot for life of any kind. But another question we get, which I'm not trying to answer this question, and nobody knows, is if there is life on Venus, how did it originate? Because that's a tough one. But we really like to envision a surface water ocean on Venus, that Venus, like Earth, formed with a lot of water. Perhaps life evolved there like it did on Earth, and that as Venus eventually underwent a runaway greenhouse where the water oceans evaporated and the water photodissociated with hydrogen escaping to space, that perhaps life migrated to the clouds and eventually became able to survive in the clouds. That's kind of what we like. And there's some weak evidence. I don't know if it's weak, but there's evidence that there were water oceans. There's weak evidence for a type of mineral on the Venus surface that had to form in water. There's the D to H ratio. If there was water and it left, that the lighter element leaves more easily. But just the other day, actually, and this is sort of showing you this field is very contentious. There's a lot of different opinions. There was a paper that said that Venus was always too hot and that perhaps it never had water oceans. And this model is a three-dimensional model, and I just highlighted a couple of points for you because there's like a feedback. If the planet is so hot that it can't form water clouds, reflective clouds, it'll just stay hot. And if it's too hot for water to ever condense into liquid, Venus might never have had an ocean. But on the other hand, if it's just cool enough and water clouds can form and the planet can cool, it can actually get cool enough for a water ocean to form. I've completely oversimplified this problem for you, and I'm not going to speak specifically to this diagram. But I just want you to know that the physics of the atmosphere is incredibly complicated, and there's a lot of feedbacks. And even in the paper itself, it had this quote on the bottom that we can't just predict what a sensitivity test would do. Someone actually has to go and run that. And these models tend to be very sensitive to cloud microphysics, convection schemes, and other things like that. So we don't know for sure if Venus had an ocean. There are new missions planned to go to Venus. One is called Da Vinci, and it's going to be doing some surface mapping. It's going to be an orbiter and a probe, and will include the ability to study reflectance spectra of the surface to see what minerals are there, and it will also do a better job than in the past of measuring the D to H ratios. Any more questions so far? Yes?
I have two questions. One is about the sulfur dioxide that you mentioned earlier.
Do you mind using the microphone just so the Zoom folks can?
So I just have some vague memory about sulfur dioxide and clouds, and that they could trigger formation of clouds or something like this. And
Yeah, so on Earth, there's some sulfur dioxide, and it gets into like a more complicated sulfur molecules in our atmosphere. And it was thought for a while that formed cloud condensation nuclei and played a big role on clouds. But that theory has somewhat gone away now.
So you're not worried about sulfur dioxide like being mismeasured on Venus because of things like this?
Well, not necessarily, but it does vary because sulfur dioxide is definitely the source of the Venus concentrated sulfuric acid clouds. Yeah.
Right. So then, okay. And yeah, and the other question I had, which maybe you're going to get to, is I thought people had suggested planets of Venus as a source, possible place for life, as opposed to just Venus itself. Is that
Wait,
true?
can you say that again? I didn't hear that.
Planets of Venus? Sorry, moons of Venus. I'm
Moons
sorry,
of Venus. Yeah, but
sorry.
Venus doesn't have any moons, so
So,
maybe
so-
you mean moon. You might mean moons of Jupiter or.
So there, okay. So
Yeah.
yeah, so moons, right? Okay, that
Okay,
answers that question.
Well, let
Okay.
me just try to address that though, because it's true. People are suggesting pretty much everything that can have life
Right.
is worth searching for life. So that is totally true. So it might have triggered a spot in your brain where some other possibly equally unlikely homes for life also have life.
Right.
There's a moon of Saturn called Titan, which has liquid ethane and methane lakes. So it has liquid, but a very kind of exotic type of liquid. There's Enceladus, one of Saturn's moons that has geysers of water that people
That was the
want
one I was thinking of. You're
Enceladus,
correct.
yeah. People, so it's sort of like this field, I was saying yesterday was related to this, that the line between what is crazy and what is mainstream is constantly shifting. So I may be guilty of it too, but we want to really think that anything that has life might have life.
So
Yep.
is a moon more likely, because then you don't have to get into these questions of how the droplets form life? Or
Not
whatever?
really. I mean, really people want to say that life requires a liquid of any kind, the right temperature for molecules to have atoms to have covalent bonds so we can get complex molecules, a source of energy, and maybe changing conditions to kind of instigate Darwinian evolution. So it really doesn't have anything to do with whether it's a moon or a planet, because the moons of Jupiter and Saturn just happen to have a source of water. And so that's kind of where it all comes from.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'd be happy to answer more questions too. So, all right, yes. Great.
Can you wait for the microphone, please?
Is the temperature in steady state, or is the planet cooling?
Yeah, what's interesting is the temperature is basically in steady state, actually. And Venus is a very interesting planet. It's not tidally locked like we talked about yesterday, but actually it's rotating very slowly, so its day is longer than a year. And although it's year, yeah, and it's heated so much on one side, but people don't understand the origins, but it's got very fast winds that super rotate around the planet and move energy around. So it's really like rather remarkably having the same temperature as heated by the sun. And yeah, basically stable.
Okay, thank you.
There's a question in the chat. May I read it?
Sure.
It was mentioned that pH 3 would not remain stable in a highly oxidized atmosphere. So how does pH 3 remain stable in Venus's highly oxidized upper middle atmosphere where it was detected? In addition, if pH 3 is there, should we expect some oxidized phosphorus-bearing species as well?
Good question. So the whole premise of a biosignature gas is it's one that has to be continually produced for us to see it. So yes, phosphine is unstable. And yes, it should result in some oxidized phosphorus species, though none are in gas form. Okay, ready to move on? Because I'm going to move on to my next topic. But first, I had this little thing I didn't know where to stick it in. But it was in the spirit of like all the new work going on for Venus that I wanted to share with you. So one of the contentious points about Venus being a habitable world is these droplets of concentrated acid. They're terrible for life. They're so acidic they fall off of our pH scale. And there's some videos like about sugars and sulfuric acid where the sugars just go, whoa, like it's really bad. I was going to tell you about a high school intern who worked on this project during the pandemic summer and was trying to like do some experiments of what survives in sulfuric acid. Maybe a 17-year-old, like I don't know if you know any 17-year-olds, but you put an ant in sulfuric acid. Not what I would do. Be nice to the environment. So the ant immediately immediately died and liquefied, basically. So most biological materials, they can't survive in this at all. But some stuff does, remarkably, like waxes, graphite, sulfur itself. And here there's a postdoc here, Daniel Duzdovich, who's been doing some experiments with lipids that actually some certain type of lipids will self-form into a sphere. So you could imagine if there is life and it's got some kind of membrane that is made of lipids or any of those other materials, it actually would resist against sulfuric acid, protecting what's inside. There's some other work being done by Steve Benner and Jan Spacek. And they actually, so what they did was they're going to assume there's a simple hydrocarbon that came from a meteorite that's inside a sulfuric acid droplet, and they shone a UV light on it in their lab, and it ended up generating like a cascade of chemistry, showing there could be some complex hydrocarbon chemistry going on in these droplets. So there's work going on for people to understand if there is life, how could it survive? It's going to be very different from our own biochemistry. And I'm going to talk a bit about this next topic next. And this is where I get to this signs of life or conjunction fallacy. And so in Venus, it's really interesting, but part of what the people I brought together on my team did was look back into old data. And it's really interesting if you try to move into a different field and take a fresh perspective. And part of this work was done by Paul Rimmer. He is a postdoc in Cambridge, UK. This work is all this part of it, where he looked back in the old data. Actually, I've got to start that again. Okay, so people have looked back in old data, and there are several unexplained things, actually, from decades ago. There's a tiny amount of oxygen in the Venus atmosphere. There may have been ammonia measured there. There's other things I'll get to in a moment. But it's interesting because if we put all these together, that's what this next part of my talk is about, we actually could hypothesize there's life there, and it solves a bunch of these chemical anomalies that have been lingering for decades. But we have to be careful, right? Because there is this thing called the conjunction fallacy, which means that each one of these unusual chemistry or unexplained chemistries, they could have their own unique explanation in chemistry. So I don't want to mislead you and say, wow, there has to be life because I can explain all of them with the assumption of life being there. So that's a little complicated, and I'm going to walk you through this. So one of the anomalies on Venus, by the way, is you see the patterns on this planet. This is an ultraviolet image taken by a Japanese orbiter. And people actually, these ultraviolet absorbers, they're called, people actually don't know the composition of them. Yet they absorb over 50% of all the ultraviolet radiation from our sun that falls on Venus. So that's one of the unexplained things. You know, people love to think that maybe it's some kind of life form doing absorbing, like a photochemistry, you know, absorbing light, because it's absorbing a lot of light. But we actually don't know what it is. So that's the anomalous UV absorber. That one I'm not going to explain, but there's some other things too. Some of the particles, I told you how Pioneer Venus measured the particle size distribution and also got an index of refraction. Well, some of the particles, we don't know what they're made of, and they appear to be non-spherical, which means that they can't be pure concentrated sulfuric acid. They have to have something else in them. And some of the gases that are anomalous that we can't explain, they involve oxygen that's there in very small quantities. There has been a tentative detection of ammonia by 2 different probes, the Russian probes and the Pioneer Venus. There's sulfur dioxide that has a major depletion in the cloud levels, and there's water vapor that can't be explained as well. There's a few other things going on too, but I wanted to walk you through a little bit of this. So I'm now showing you a model from Paul Rimmer, a photochemistry model of Venus. And this is showing you height above the surface in kilometers. So the clouds are between about 48 and let's say 60 kilometers, even up to like 70 kilometers. And this is showing you mixing ratio, which is a jargon for fractional amount by volume. And this dotted line is showing you sulfur dioxide in a base model, where if you imagine sulfur dioxide coming out of volcanoes and mixing through the atmosphere, and somewhere very high up, photochemistry, ultraviolet radiations from the sun will destroy sulfur dioxide. That's what you should get just in a base model. But these points with error bars here are showing you data. So how does this model match the data? Like, it really doesn't match at all. It's so far away, because look, here we're saying that if the model is saying that there's 1 part per million. So at some level, you know, the model is saying we should have 1 part per 10,000 of sulfur dioxide, but the data is showing we have like orders of magnitude less sulfur dioxide. So that's a really big problem. So what happens is traditionally is that models have to artificially do something in their model to fit the data. And I was surprised to find out that it's somewhat standard. So this dashed line here is a photochemistry model, like artificially removing sulfur dioxide in the cloud layer. And I don't know if in your field you have this, where there's just something unexplained, but in order to work with the whole system, you just sort of fudge that part and then work on the other parts. Well, there's the model that Paul Rimmer has worked on that we're trying to explain all the anomalies. It makes a pretty big assumption, but that the ammonia does exist and that life in the clouds is producing ammonia. And what happens when this ammonia is produced is it dissolves in the cloud droplets. And now there's some chemistry involved, but it is a buffer. It acts, it's like a base. It goes into the droplet, and it sets off a chain of chemical reactions where sulfur dioxide gets dissolved in the droplet. And it naturally, this assumption that there's ammonia with the hydrosulfuric acid droplets, it ends up naturally depleting sulfur dioxide in the cloud layer. And that's what the solid line is. So it doesn't fit the data perfectly, but actually it does fit the data a lot better. And in this model, so assuming that there's ammonia, I'm going to walk you through each of these. This one is sulfur dioxide, this is water vapor, this one is oxygen. And the dotted line, again, is like a base model. And the dashed line is with some artificial fixes to the data, or artificially depleting sulfur dioxide. And in the end, this new model ends up fitting the data very well. So I'm going to just kind of walk you through some text here. The gases of interest we'd like to remeasure are oxygen, present at tens of parts per million. Ammonia might be there. There's vertical abundance profiles of sulfur dioxide and water vapor that are not as yet not understood. And these mode 3 cloud particles, they're not pure concentrated sulfuric acid, but we don't know what they are. So this hypothesis that life produces ammonia, the ammonia dissolves in the droplet, neutralizes the acid droplet, and then there's a cascade of chemistry that happens where the droplets trap dissolved sulfur dioxide. By the way, the most energy efficient way for life to produce ammonia, it also generates oxygen. And so as a result of this cascade of chemistry, some of the droplets are not pure concentrated sulfuric acid, but they have to be something else because the ammonia in the droplet will react with sulfur dioxide compounds and make ammonium salt slurries. That was kind of a lot. I have a paper on this. If you'd like to see it, just let me know. I'll send you a copy. It's not finished being reviewed yet. That was a really complicated way that I brushed a lot of chemistry under the rug there, but I just wanted you to know that there's a lot of work going on Venus, and this one piece of work, we're actually trying to explain all the chemical anomalies. We just have to make the assumption that A, there's life in the clouds, and B, that life is producing ammonia, and it sets off a cascade of events which explain these anomalies to some level. Now, a consequence of this is really amazing, but if there is ammonia and it's dissolved in these cloud droplets, all of a sudden they're less acidic. They no longer fall off the chart for acidity, and they're still very acidic, but they're in line with the most acidic environments on Earth where there is life. Yes, question?
Can you elaborate a little bit on what you mean by there is life in the context of, is it photosynthetic, it's aerobic, anaerobic, does it matter? I mean, because there are so many different kinds, and in particular in the context of these gases, depending on whether carbon dioxide is a source, is a sink. So.
Yes, okay, that's a complicated question. We don't have the question is what kind of life is this? What is the life doing? So we don't have like a full ecosystem concept worked out, right? So there could be photosynthetic life. In this case, it's life using energy to make ammonia. So, and it's anaerobic because there's no oxygen there. Yep. But one thing I forgot to mention was, oddly enough, there is life on Earth that secretes ammonia to neutralize droplets. Life inside stomach linings where it's incredibly acidic does that. Any other questions on this? I don't feel like I did a great job explaining it, so when my paper comes out, when my group's paper come out, you can read it. So one of the things about Venus that is so great is, we can have any kind of theory, any kind of concept or theory we want, but Venus is technically reachable. And we want to go back to Venus and make measurements of a specific kind to substantiate these ideas, or just really to see what's going on there. Wouldn't that be great if we could measure the acidity of the droplets? So we could tell what they're made of, and whether this theory makes, we want to go back there. So NASA is going back to Venus. There's 2 missions, and ESA has a mission going back to Venus, but none of these do any astrobiology. So after the whole phosphine thing, I did something a bit different, actually. I got some private money, and I created a team to work on what should we go back to Venus and do, if we could. And one of the things I did with this team on purpose was with one exception, is I didn't choose any established experts on Venus. And I also tried to purposely avoid, I don't know how to say this, but let's say cranky older people. So like in my own field, I'm a cranky older person. But I didn't want any entrenched views like being pushed on the group. And so it ended up being a lot of work, because with the one exception expert on Venus, we had to relearn everything from scratch, or learn everything from scratch. But it was an incredible experience. And we did come up with a series of missions we'd like to send to Venus. And I'm really pleased to tell you about our very first mission that's going to go to Venus. We were just sort of pie in the sky working on our ideas when it turned out that there's Rocket Lab, which is a commercial spaceflight company out of New Zealand and USA. And the CEO, founder and CEO, Peter Beck, he's always wanted to go to Venus, actually. And they independently plan to send a rocket to Venus. So my team became their science team. And so we actually work together now. And this is a new way of doing space science. The niche that Rocket Lab has are somewhat small rockets. So Rocket Lab can go to Venus, but only carry a very small probe. So the idea is that Rocket Lab would launch their rocket, and inside their rocket is a cruise vehicle called Photon that will go to Venus, and Photon will drop off a small probe that's about 15 to 20 kilograms, and this probe will drop through the atmosphere, because like money and mass are a real problem here. So it's not going to pop off its heat shield, so we have to be careful about ablation from the heat shield, contaminating the measurements we do. And it will drop through the atmosphere. It will last about an hour, but it will only spend 3 minutes in the clouds. And we're also going to send data direct back to Earth, so our whole entire data budget is really tiny. And so the goal is originally we had 2 instruments, but we had to down select. So what we chose to do is we chose to do we call it an autofluorescing nephelometer. Like what Pioneer Venus did, where it shone a light out a window and measured what came back in polarization and light intensity. We're going to repeat that and try to confirm the shape and the composition of these mode 3 particles. But what's new about our instrument, what we hope to do, is also to look for autofluorescence so that our laser light going out of the window will be ultraviolet. And if there's organic material, we have to choose our wavelength carefully, but if there's organic material in the droplets, we have some chance of detecting it by autofluorescence. We're still working on the instrument. Prototype is being built right now, and this would be the first out of a series of missions. Our second mission that we hope to send later on this decade is a balloon mission, and this is showing you an entry vehicle where the entry vehicle has this drogue chute to slow it down, and eventually this pops off and there's a balloon that inflates. And this balloon would be a fixed altitude balloon. It's inspired by the Vega missions from Russia in the late 1970s. They sent 2 balloons. They lasted about 48 hours each. They had like their own power. They brought batteries. And in this, you can see there's this balloon. It would be about 4 meters in diameter. It would have a gondola. And we have several instruments. I wrote down here the things we want to do. We want to search for these gases, ammonia and phosphine, and measure the water vapor and sulfur dioxide abundances as a function of altitude. We'd like to look for organic molecules and metals in the cloud droplets, measure acidity of the cloud particles, and even prepare for sample return. This project would be a private-public partnership. We'd have we've been working this actually, international partners. Like for example, working on like India, Poland, and a bunch of other countries as well. So yeah, thanks to our industrial partners, a summary of the mission is we want to go back to Venus, make very specific measurements to see if Venus is indeed habitable and whether or not there are any signs of life there. So to summarize, Venus, the takeaway I want you to have is that Venus has many long-standing mysteries. And I want you to think about your own field or peripheral fields and ask yourself, what is there that is still unexplained? What is still unexplained? There's many gases of interest on Venus, as well as these lower cloud particles that we don't know what they're made of. It is genuinely a new era for Venus exploration. There's 3 NASA and ESA missions going at the end of this decade, 2 orbiters and 1 probe. They aren't focusing on astrobiology, so we're being complementary, and we're aiming for a focused series of missions that can really answer the question of whether or not Venus is a habitable world. That concludes my talk, and thank you for your attention.
Sorry to be the only one here asking questions, but but it's really interesting. But how will you be able to tell if ammonia is from life or not? I mean, it's nice that you have this consistency thing, but how would you be able to, like, what are the things that really you would point to as the ones that would really say this, even if you find ammonia, that it is associated with life?
Well, we'd have to, there's sort of like the natural equilibrium that the system wants to go to. And then there's a disequilibrium. So if we find a disequilibrium, like honestly until now, that is a good sign of life. But if you want actual proof there's life, like 100% robust evidence, we want to bring a sample of Venus's atmosphere back to Earth and to actually look for life. And during this study, we worked out like, should we, we could bring a mass spectrometer that's very, very sensitive and find complex organic molecules, but that still won't do the job. We could try to bring a microscope, but any of the microscopes suitable, they can't get down to like a small enough size resolution to assure us that we haven't missed anything. So I'm just gonna I don't even wanna really go there. That's what my series of talks is about, the search for life. And sort of as we're getting closer to that time when we can find biosignature gases on exoplanets, we're confronted with phosphine or ammonia on Venus and methane on Mars, we're starting to find this very harsh reality that you just asked about. How are we gonna prove it? We're actually not. We're gonna have to.
I'm not even asking for 100% proof. I'm just asking, what are the things that distinguish ammonia from life and not from life? And you're saying it has to do with
the thing about
equilibrium
ammonia
versus
is that it takes energy to make ammonia in that environment. It's not just going to kind of happen on its own because it takes energy. And life, let's say, for example, life wants to make ammonia to neutralize the droplets so it can survive there. Life does alter its environment. So, ammonia it's really hard to, you could work out, here are some alternate ways we could get ammonia, like meteorites or lightning or volcanoes. And you could work out how much could be produced under your set of assumptions. But you'd find that none of those are satisfactory in any way, actually. But then you could push it more and say, do we really know what Venus is made of on the inside? And the answer is no. Yeah, so it's really those things that could produce it, lightning, volcanoes, meteorites, and they can't really.
So you're saying it would either have to be there or it would have to be produced by life?
I mean, there's sort of, that would be, that's what I'd like to say, yes.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Questions in the chat? Hold on. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, wait.
You mentioned earlier that the very highly concentrated acid that is there and life, the example you mentioned with the ant dissolving quickly. Do we know forms of life on Earth that would survive something very highly acidic, any bacteria or any?
There is a life on Earth that survives in very acidic environments of a pH of about 1 or so, or maybe 0. And it's some kind of simple microbe that can survive there. But this concentrated sulfuric acid, it's like orders of magnitude more acidic. So in pure concentrated sulfuric acid, no.
Okay.
Yep.
Thanks.
That's why we'd like to go there and measure the acidity of the droplets and see what's really going on.
Yes. One was if folks are interested in seeing the paper that you mentioned, how do they go about contacting
we'll
you?
probably put it on the archive in about 2 weeks from now. But if you want to drop me an email, I can send it to you.
Okay. Perhaps you'll send it to Yolanta and we'll distribute
Sure,
it.
Sure.
Okay.
Well, if they send me an email, Seager, Seager, @mit.edu.
Okay, I'll put that in the chat while you answer this. Let me read this
Sure.
question. As the sun proceeds with becoming a red giant, wouldn't that make missions to Venus gradually impossible due to increased radiation and super increased temperatures?
When our sun becomes a red giant, billions of years from now, I just want to say, I don't mean to be dismissive, but we'll have other problems at that time. So we'll have to become way more technologically sophisticated if we want to survive. We'll have to move out to one of Jupiter's moons or beyond.
So you showed the image earlier with the Venus, which show that it captures some UV light, like UV radiation. Would that mean that Venus would have some kind of a thin layer of ozone? Because if we can find ozone on Venus, we can also, that checks your theory about ammonia, because you said it needs to also produce oxygen, right? And yeah, oxygen can transform very easily to ozone. But also another question, if we want to detect ozone, would it be a good idea to, when we send a mission there, to measure the sulfur, the fractionation, the sulf-33 fractionation?
Okay, so there's a lot of questions there. So I'm going to have to answer your question about ozone another time. Like, to my knowledge, there's no or not very much ozone there. I haven't heard of people wanting to measure the sulfur fractionation, but it might be something that, I mean, for solid sulfur, that probably won't happen because it has to happen at the surface where it's really hard to operate. But the new mission by NASA, Da Vinci, that's going to send a probe through, they're trying to measure isotopes of all kinds, so they'll get some sulfur isotopes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I was wondering. Thank you very much for the great talk. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on what exactly are the measurements that the new mission that you're planning to Venus is going to make, and how that will contribute to assessing the habitability in addition to the information we have now.
That's a good question. Okay, so you heard the question. So, okay, the question is, what will this Rocket Lab mission with the very small payload do to contribute to habitability? Okay, so this mission, like if we want to design the mission from scratch to make big progress, that's like a very expensive, complicated mission. So we're kind of doing what we can within the mass and the financial budget. So, and it kind of depends what's out there too. If we're able to measure autofluorescence, if we see, we shine a UV laser that excites electrons that cascade back down and emit photons, if we can detect that, it means there's something complicated in the droplets. We can't identify what is there, but out of all the possible species, we could say what the range of things could be. But if there's some complicated chemicals in the droplets, that's a wow, worth understanding what that is. Now, it could just be completely abiotic chemistry, we won't know. But it'll tell us that there's something more complicated happening in the droplets. That's probably as far as we'll get, because we're going to remeasure the okay, one more thing is with this nephelometer, remember how all the particles have a unique, somewhat unique, three-dimensional scattering? Well, we're going to measure polarization intensity coming back from particles. And we hope to be able to actually say, like, approximately the composition of these droplets that are non-spherical. So we're not going to solve anything, but we're going to add to the idea that the picture might be way more complicated than we expect. And hopefully we can constrain what the composition is, and that will somehow be related to habitability. Yeah.
This is a question in the chat from earlier. I think you might have answered it, but I'm not sure. What would be, for you, the main implications of finding life on Venus? Are there specific hypotheses discussed in academia about the emergence of life that could be inferred from that?
No, this idea of the search for life on Venus is still really kind of out there, so it's not really discussed that much. Let's see. I'm so fixated on just getting to Venus with this first mission. I don't have a great answer to that. I think everyone here could, or the people online, everyone has their own idea for what it would mean if we find life elsewhere. If we can prove it's a truly independent genesis, I think it actually must imply that life is ubiquitous. If we can show that life there is unique to Earth and didn't form here, but genuinely formed on Venus, it would be amazing.
So you showed that pretty picture of the rainbow, which depends sensitively on the index of refraction. What does a sulfur dioxide droplet rainbow look like?
Okay, that's a good question. I don't have the picture in my head, but if you come tomorrow, I'll bring a picture of it. Thank you. Thanks.